Well, Al, thanks for joining us here for our Oral Histories project. It's a pleasure having you. If you would just tell me your name, uh, where you're from, and what branch you were in, and what periods.
Well, my name is Al Gorthy, actually Al Gorthy Jr. Um, I'm joined the Navy in 1968. Spent 26 years on active duty, and then I retired in 1994. I flew for the Navy for most of that period of time, and enjoyed every minute of it. Got to fly mostly single seat attack and fighter aircraft, and flew some of the nation's state of the art material aircraft that was available at that time. Participated in the Vietnam War. That was early on during my first couple of years, and then just stayed with it. Enjoyed it.
Where are you from, Al?
I was born and raised here in Kansas City, down by the KU Medical Center. I'm one of 7 children. Lived in a small house, 2-story, 4-bedroom, 1 bathroom. Went to a parochial school. Went to a small high school here in Kansas City called Rosedale. And then I ended up at the University of Missouri in Kansas City, and I majored in biology because I thought at the time I wanted to pursue a degree in dentistry. I thank my lucky stars that I wasn't accepted.
Well, glad to see that of the 2 states, you chose the best university in the 2 states to attend college. uh, I myself am a Sun Devil, but I grew up, a Missouri fan, and actually had a scholarship to wrestle at Missouri and joined the Army. So I still watch and cheer for Missouri wrestling. The so what made you decide on the Navy or military in general, and then specifically the Navy?
Well, and it was a pretty simple decision for me. In 1968, the Vietnam War was pretty hot and heavy, and to be honest with you, I had not even had that on my radar scope. It was I hadn't read much news. I knew it was going on, but I wasn't involved in in much of reading about it or hearing about it or learning about it. But when I wasn't accepted to dental school, I realized soon thereafter that I got my draft notice in the mail. And that was kind of a wake-up call for me. And I had a very high lottery number. So I knew I was going to get picked. I knew I was going. And so I decided at the time that if I was going to go into the service, I wanted to select the service, the branch that I wanted to go into. And I wanted to do something that challenged me, and I wanted to learn a new skill. And I don't know where I saw it, but I saw this poster somewhere that had an airplane coming aboard an aircraft carrier, and it had Fly Navy on it, and go visit the recruiter at Olathe Naval Air Station. And so there was a phone number there, and I called him up, and he invited me to come out. I took a couple of tests. He said I passed. I'm not sure I did pass, but he said I passed. And then he said I had a date in Pensacola shortly thereafter. So that's pretty much how my career started. They were losing so many pilots in Vietnam during that time that I'm sure that the selection process was, if you had a degree from college and you had a desire to fly, they would at least give you the opportunity to see if you had the skill level and the acuity to do it. So that's pretty much how I I got into the service and how I selected the Navy.
So did you go in through like an OCS program, or I'm not sure what's called the Navy? If it's the
No,
special
since I
program.
had my degree, I went into what they called an aviation officer candidate program. And it was about 16 weeks of officer training. And then following that, I was designated a naval officer. And then shortly thereafter, I entered the flight program. So I first became a naval officer, and then I went from there directly into the flight program, which took about another 18 months to finally get my Navy wings.
Then, so was the pilot training also in Pensacola?
The pilot training at that time was really spread around the country. You initially started in Pensacola, and then once you flew about maybe 13, 14 hours and soloed in a small Beechcraft airplane, then a determination was made whether you would qualify for a jet pipeline, a prop, or a helo. So there were 3 pipelines right there, and obviously I wanted to fly jets. Apparently my grades were good enough that I got selected to the jet program, and then I went to Meridian, Mississippi, to start my basic jet training. Following basic jet training, which lasted maybe 6 months or so, that was our first opportunity then to take an airplane to the ship to see if we could carrier qualify. And then following a successful carrier qualification in a basic jet, then you went to Kingsville, Texas, to fly an advanced jet, a swept wing airplane. And another 6 months or so of that type of training. And then we took that swept wing airplane to the carrier for some more carrier qualifications. And then following that, you were designated a naval aviator.
So I've never in person seen a jet land on a carrier. I would imagine even witnessing it from the carrier and landing that jet on the carrier, especially for your first time, would be 2 totally different experiences. What was that like, your first time coming into an aircraft carrier, landing that thing?
Well, it was, I don't know if it was terrifying. Obviously, it was different. It was stressful. It was exciting. But you have to remember that before they're going to take you to the carrier, you're going to practice landing under the control of a landing signal officer on the field many, many, many times. And they have the runway painted in the same dimensions as an aircraft carrier. So you have this kind of same picture in your mind as you go to the ship. But I'll be honest with you, the first time you see an aircraft carrier from 10,000 feet, it's a pretty small dot in the ocean. And the first time you roll into the groove, into the landing, a mile or so back from the ship, and you look at that landing area, it is very small. But by the same token, you're well trained. You know what to look for, you know what to do, and you just really have to trust your training. And if you can trust your training and don't get spooked by, the rest of the stuff that's out there, the ship is moving, you're going to be okay. Just trust your training. Night, however, is different. Night carrier landings for the first time is terrifying. Although you do have an enormous amount of training, you do not only daytime on the field, many landings. They also have a very sophisticated simulator that they put you in, and you do night carrier landing simulations in this simulator, but it is nothing like the real thing. It is difficult. It is the thing about night carrier landings is that your visual horizon is taken away from you. So you're in this black hole, and when you look outside, that's all you see is a black hole. So you don't really know if your wings are level, if your nose is up, if it's down. You can't see the water. You can't see the sky. It's just blackness. And then you see the small spotted light of the ship up ahead, and you really have to be flying on your instruments, really trust your training, stay focused on all of the procedures that you need to stay focused on, proper airspeed, proper altitude, proper lineup. And then, once you get 3/4 of a mile from the back end of the ship, you take over visually, and down the glide path you come. It's hard. It's very hard.
So if I understand this correctly, you're basically you're in the dark, and you're going off your instruments, and maybe someone who's talking to you on the thing, or is it just you?
It's pretty much you. Mm-hmm. You know the procedures to fly. You know the proper navigational signals to fly on. So you just line your airplane up on those signals, and you track down those signals until you pick up the ship visually, and you continue to fly your instruments until you get to about a mile, and then you begin to transition from instrument flying to visual flying. That's when you begin to see the lights of the ship. That's when you begin to see the strobe lights on the landing area, which is about that big. You begin to see the landing aid. That's when the landing signal officer begins to talk to you also for additional help. He will tell you, in his opinion, if you're high, if you're a little low, if you're a little underpowered, if you have too much power on. So yeah, it's but once again, you have a tremendous amount of training at the field before you go to the ship at night. But regardless,
is there a little bit of disorientation when you transition from being in that hole as you talk about to visually orienting? Like it's kind of like, oh, is there any of that going on?
There is some disorientation. There is some what we call the leans or vertigo, because when you can't see the horizon, it's very difficult to keep your wings level. So, and that's where the landing signal officer really comes in to help. He will help you with trying to get you lined up. But it is very difficult. But the closer you get to the ship, the more visual reference you're getting on, and you're beginning to see a little bit of the ship structure, and now you're beginning to pick out, where the horizon is, at least what is level.
Mm-hmm. So, what is more terrifying, would you say, a night carrier landing, or riding passenger seat with your wife through rush hour?
Well, night carrier landings. There's not too many things that I did in the service. I don't think there was anything that I did that was more demanding, more difficult, required precision, absolute precision, very stressful. And very difficult, very difficult. Not only is landing on a ship difficult at night, but then you've got the added stress of you've got other guys and gals that are out there trying to do the same thing, and everybody has got to get aboard. So if someone is having trouble, they may delay you from coming aboard, which means you're using more gas. So you've got you've got fuel problems, fuel considerations, you've got weather considerations, you have a pitching deck or a moving deck considerations. There are a lot of considerations out there that make this a very difficult thing. And then, if you get to the point where you need additional fuel, then you're going to have to go up to the tanker at night and then perform another very demanding maneuver, night tanking, to get some additional fuel. So it's a very, very demanding, a very stressful portion of naval aviation. But I would say that daytime flight operations is. I'm not going to say that I ever got comfortable doing it, but it was certainly less stressful. Nighttime operations, I don't think I ever got to the point where I was even close to being comfortable. It was just so demanding.
So do they always have a tanker in the air above like a carrier in case someone needs to refuel? It's like just kind of standard that one is up there.
I'm not going to say always, but I would say a very high percentage of the time you're always going to have fuel airborne, because you just don't know the uncertainties. You could have an incident on the flight deck, which closes the flight deck for a while. You could have an aircraft accident on the flight deck, which closes the landing area for a while. Many of these ships today are operating in what we call blue water operations, where no divert field is available. So the only field available is the carrier. So, if you have an incident on the flight deck, which closes the landing area, you've got to get that landing area cleaned off quickly in order for the other airplanes that are still airborne to be able to land. And if they're running out of fuel, then you've got to have a tanker airborne. So I would say in a great majority of the time, there will be fuel airborne, always.
I did not know that. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's really amazing. So, sounds like about 2 years total of training?
About 18 months, 18 months to 2 years to get your Navy wings. Yes, mm-hmm. and it gives you a little bit of a taste of all of the different types of flying that you will be required to do, from low-level training to bombing to air-to-air dogfighting to tanking to carrier landings to instrumentation, formation flying, all the different sets of training you will have a taste of, both in the basic jet training and then going into it advanced.
So that puts you hitting the fleet, right? Is that the right word? About 71?
Hit the fleet in 1971, in December 1971, and then you transition to your fleet aircraft. Now that you have your Navy wings, you go into your assigned aircraft that you're going to be flying in combat, and that was the A-7 for me, the A-7 Corsair. And that takes about another 6 months to 8 months of training, and once again, you're going to go through all the different phases of flight: low level, instrumentation, bombing, tanking, and then again, daytime and nighttime carrier qualifications. This time, you will be exposed to shooting live ordnance and to dropping live ordnance for the first time. So you're exposed to to a new, more advanced phases of training. But you're still very green. You're still very inexperienced. You haven't been to the fleet yet, as far as on an operating carrier, but you're being trained by some highly qualified, very experienced, in my situation, very experienced Vietnam combat pilots.
So, if you're not, so so basically it's your plane, right? Now that you're gonna be flying is what you're saying. Like, that's what you get, and that's, you got to train on your plane to become proficient.
Yes, you're going to be when you get assigned to a specific a specific training squadron, they know that you are going to be assigned to a squadron eventually that is going to have the same type of airplane that you're training in. So in Vietnam, for example, there were A7s, there were A4s, there were A1s, there was an F4 Phantom, there was F8s. So it just depended on the combat pipeline that you went to. And I was assigned to go to the A7 pipeline, and I went to that training squadron. We trained in the A7 for 8 months, and then I was assigned to an A7 squadron on board a carrier.
And so, tell us about the A7. What is that? What is that like?
The A7 was a small, pretty much a small, lightweight airplane. It was a single seat, single engine. It carried an awful lot of ordnance. Its primary mission was a daytime bomber, although it did have a significant amount of nighttime capability. You could shoot air-to-air weapons off of it. It had a Gatling gun, a 20-millimeter Gatling gun in the front end. You could carry all kinds of bombs on the wings, from just a kind of what we call a dumb bomb to more smart type of weapons. And then, of course, it also had the capability of dropping mines, so you could go in and mine a harbor, for example. So it had a great capability. It carried a lot of fuel. So your mission was about, maybe 2 hours long without tanking. So that was, had fairly good legs on it. You could go into a target that was pretty long distance away and come back out and still have a little bit of gas to get aboard the ship. So it was a good airplane. A little bit, wasn't supersonic, but it was a good airplane. It was a workhorse of the Vietnam War.
What size? What was the typical size bomb? Like a Mark 85 or?
A typical bomb that we carried was a 500-pound Mark 82. We'd carry a 1,000-pound, and then I'm not sure if we ever carried a 2,000-pound bomb. I think probably the heaviest bomb that we carried was maybe a 1,000-pound bomb. We could carry probably 12 500-pound bombs. 6 on each wing. So it was a pretty good load.
It's a lot of boom boom.
Yeah.
I blew up a lot of those in Iraq.
Yeah, a lot of bombs.
Mm-hmm. Would you typically drop that number in one pass?
It really depended on the target that we were going to. Sometimes, if we were working in an area of Vietnam that was kind of a low threat area, further down to the south, below the DMZ, we would be working with Air Force forward air controllers, and they would pick out a target for us. They would mark it with smoke, and then we would normally drop one bomb on that smoke or near that smoke target, as the forward air controller would call us in. Sometimes he would want 2. Sometimes he would want more than 2. So it really depended on what the forward air controller wanted. That was down south. As the farther we moved north into a more highly contested area where there was a lot of AAA, a lot of SAMs, a lot of heavily defended areas up there, we would normally make one pass, drop everything we had, and get out of there.
Reminds me of, we had these people quartering this little bitty hut, and all of a sudden, all the Abrams and Hellfire and everything they had rained down this little bitty hut, and we were like, really? We have to do all this? Sometimes you just make sure the job gets done, right?
Exactly.
How long then were you operating in and out of Vietnam? It seems like there's a pretty high demand for your mission over there. Were you pretty much just pulling in and out of there until the conflict was pulled back?
Well, I was assigned to a squadron called VA 25, and they had A-7s, and we deployed in, I believe it was November of 1972. Or maybe it was October of 1972. I can't really recall. But it was in 1972, the fall of 1972, and we got over to Vietnam, and the war was going on. We were doing an awful lot of bombing, both south and north at the time. And then, if you recall, there were some Paris peace talks that were going on, and during the Paris peace talks, there would be a bombing halt, because they didn't want to be doing any bombing during the Paris peace talks. And then the Paris peace talks failed, and then the bombing resumed. So it was kind of an off again, on again bombing campaign. And what we found was that every time that there was a bombing halt, the North Vietnamese would resupply with all of their defensive weapons. And then when the bombing resumed, we found that there was a tremendous amount of, obviously AAA SAMs coming up at us. So we didn't particularly care for a bombing halt, because that meant that they would get resupplied. But in December, matter of fact, it was December the 18th, 1972, there was an operation called Linebacker 2. And it was when President Nixon had come to the realization that he wanted to end the war, and he ordered a massive bombing campaign of North Vietnam. It was called Linebacker 2 operations. We didn't know how long it was going to last, but we knew when it was going to start, and it was December the 18th. And in reality, it lasted about 11 days. And I think there's a book out called The 11 Days of Christmas, or it may be The 12 Days of Christmas, I can't remember. But there were 5 carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin at the time, and we were one of them. And these 5 carriers would operate on a schedule of 3 of them would be noon to midnight, and the other 2 would be midnight to noon. And of all the firepower that all of those 5 carriers had, it was round-the-clock bombing. Plus, the Air Force was in Thailand and in Guam, and there was a massive coordinated strike all the time, around the clock, of B-52s coming out of not only Thailand but out of Guam, and then the rest of the Air Force operating out of Thailand, and then the Navy coming from the Gulf of Tonkin, kind of pinching this country. Then we mined the harbors of Haiphong to keep all the ships out from resupplying. We provided anti-radiation missile support for the B-52s that were coming in to keep the SAM missiles from firing at them. But it was an intense bombing campaign that eventually brought the North Vietnamese finally back to the table, and it resulted in not only a ceasefire but an end of the war. And it resulted in the release of the 500 and some prisoners of war in March of 1973. So it was an intense bombing campaign. We lost a lot of airplanes. The Air Force lost a lot of B-52s, F-4s. We lost 1 A-7 during that event. But it was very intense.
What year was that?
That was 1972. There was the operation was called Linebacker 2 Operations, December 18th through the 29th of 1972. December 29, 1972.
So that essentially that was your last time in Vietnam, right?
That was the Vietnam War.
Operation, at least.
The Vietnam War ended at that point. The prisoners of war were released in March of the following year, 1973. Although we did go back to Vietnam probably the next couple of years, but there was no more bombing. There was no more fighting going on, at least from the Navy standpoint. Obviously, we all know what happened as the North Vietnamese moved further south and eventually took the country over. But we never got involved in trying to stop them after 1973.
So after Vietnam, what is what does that look like? Because I mean, we pretty much, minus a few skirmishes, but I think from a naval and bombing standpoint, we were pretty free and clear until '91, right? Is that right? Or...
That's correct. There were a few little minor incidences around the world, Grenada, Nicaragua, a few little spats here and there, but nothing major until the Gulf War, popped up. There was a pretty good drawdown of forces after the Vietnam War. Everybody began to look at the military force structure, started drawing it down a little bit. Less flying, a little bit less money, things of that nature, but wasn't bad, wasn't bad.
And coming into Desert Storm, Desert Shield, imagine you have probably ranked out of the cockpit at this point, right? You're probably more in sort of a command position or something. No.
Well, yes, I had. Actually, I retired. I retired in 1994, so I was in a position of leadership from a more managerial position. I still stayed in the cockpit, but I wasn't doing any operational flying. So I never participated in either the Gulf War or any of the wars that followed the Afghan War.
When during Vietnam, when you're on the carrier, what does your day look like? Is it like missions back to back, or you like one mission a day? What is that like? And what are you doing when you're not in mission?
Well, carrier operations when a war is going on is pretty hectic. They do come out with a schedule, an operational schedule, and you're going to find yourself flying at least once a day to keep your proficiency up, and then sometimes you're going to fly twice a day. You're going to have to fly at least. You're probably going to see yourself flying at least 2 or 3 times at night during a 7-day period, just to keep your proficiency up, because carrier operations, there's a shelf life on that, and your skill level, the bayonet dulls if you don't keep it sharp. And although you may think you've got experience, you may think you've got a lot of flight hours, that type of flying is so demanding that you've got to do it, and you've got to do it often to keep your proficiency up. So the schedule on a ship would look like, for example, if we started flying at noon and we were going from noon to midnight, you'd probably, wake at 10. If you had a noon launch, you would be in the ready room at 10 o'clock briefing. You would get your intelligence brief. You'd get your weapons load brief. You would walk out to the airplane probably 40 minutes prior to launch, do your pre-flight on the airplane, check your weapons load, get in the cockpit, get it started up, and get ready for launch. You'd launch at noon. You'd come back at probably 1:45, land. You'd go back down to intelligence, get yourself a debrief, run to the cafeteria, get a quick bite to eat. Depending on the rest of the day, if you were going to fly at night, you may want to go down to your stateroom, get a quick nap, and then back up, another brief, into your airplane at night, and out back. If you did not have a night flight, then you'd, the rest of the day was pretty much up to you. Prepare depending on the next day's schedule, depending on the difficulty of the next day's mission. You may want to start planning for that. So it kept you busy, busy. Not much time for, you know, not much time for reading, not much time for relaxing, not much time for exercise. It was pretty much all operationally oriented.
That can be good though.
It can be good. Well, the other thing that that we didn't have that they have now, they have they have internet now. All the movies that we saw came off of a reel. There were no cell phones. There's no ship-to-shore communications. So all the communications with our family was done by letters, which was probably a 2 to 3 week delay time in getting your letters home and getting a letter from home to you. So it was certainly nothing like today.
Yeah, definitely a lot more isolated. Did you do so after Vietnam? Did you do much flying? I mean, so probably not as much operational stuff, right? But what did that look like then? What was your flying career like after that?
Well, after Vietnam, there's a progression. If you stay in the service, there's an advancement progression, and obviously my goal was to see if I could reach a command structure where I could have my own command of a fighter squadron or of an attack squadron. So that was my goal. Obviously, the Navy is going to assign you to different assignments for a 2 or 3 year period of time to test your skill levels on different, and then you've got to perform, because it is peer-to-peer performance. I was fortunate enough to be selected for command of several squadrons. I commanded an F-18 squadron that was assigned to the carrier Enterprise. I was fortunate enough to command a Top Gun adversary squadron in Fallon, Nevada. I commanded an F-18 training squadron out of Lemoore, California, which had about 60-some airplanes, large squadron. And then my last command was I commanded a naval air station at Lemoore, California. So I had an opportunity to command not only operational aircraft squadrons, but also ashore, big naval air station in California.
Were you at what point did you, I guess, start a family? Was that during your naval career?
Yeah, my family. I got married. Right out of college. So I was married when I went into the Navy, and then we had our first child after about 5 years, and then I had my second child about 3 years later. So we have 2 daughters, and they lived the Navy life with us as we traveled around the country to different assignments, including an assignment in Japan for about a year. And they started heading off to college right as I began retiring. So they pretty much spent their entire years growing up with us as we traveled the country with the Navy.
So you get married and you say, "Surprise, honey, we're not going to dental school. We're going to Vietnam." How did that conversation
I think
go?
she was. I think she was pretty excited about it. She was. She's the type of a lady that pretty flexible. Looks to. Looks for adventure. Looks for excitement. I'm not exactly sure she really enjoyed moving every 2 or 3 years, but she never really did complain. Once we got to a new location, we settled down pretty quickly, got the kids in school, settled into our routine, and we knew that in another 3 years we were going to pick up and move again. So she just settled into lifestyle, and I think she probably enjoyed it as much as I did, meeting other family members, meeting other wives, enjoying the community, getting to know the different locations, getting to know and assimilating with the towns that we finally settled into.
What did your parents say when you said, the plans had changed?
My mom and dad were we did not come from a very wealthy family. My mom and dad they worked all the time, and with the 7 children, I think there was an unspoken expectation that once if you want to go to college, you're going to have to find a way to do it because we can't help you. And then once you get out of college, you're on your own. My mom and dad, I think they were happy for me that I wanted to do what I wanted to do. They never really expressed anything to me about, if they were pleased or displeased with it. I know my mother, I don't think my parents really understood the military. They thought it was something that young men and women go into, and 3 years later they come back and then get a job as an accountant or a truck driver or a doctor or a dentist. Mm-hmm. And when I decided to make a career of it, my mother was kind of taken aback because she always kept asking me, what are you going to do when you get out of the Navy? How are you going to support your family? So I don't think she really understood that the Navy is my job. The Navy is my career. The Navy is what I want to do. The Navy is how I'm going to raise my family. It's how I am going to support myself and my family. And I think that she finally, maybe after 20 years, she finally realized that, okay, this is in fact going to work. My dad, on the other hand, I think was very proud of me. My dad and my mom were never, they were the old school. They weren't the huggers. They weren't the kissers. They were kind of the tough old Germans. And, they would, you just kind of knew that they were proud of you, but they had a hard time saying it. Mm-hmm. They had a hard time saying it. They went through some pretty difficult times in their lives through the Depression, and they were struggling, and they expected their children to pull their weight. We knew as kids that if we were gonna make it, we were gonna have to make it on our own. We knew that. It was just the unspoken language of the family.
Mm-hmm. What was it like being married and being deployed in Vietnam? Because like as you said, they didn't have the internet, they didn't have the cell phones. I imagine even the mail runs were pretty hard and scarce, few and far between.
It was it wasn't the best of times. The air station that we were assigned to, Lemoore Naval Air Station, there were hundreds of airplanes assigned to that air base. Probably, I don't know the exact number, probably 20 or more squadrons that would eventually work their way to Vietnam on different carriers. The town was very small. When we got there, the town of Lemoore was only 4,000 people. The air base had more people living on it than the small town did. But it was not uncommon to see the black sedan pull up to a house, and you knew you just knew what was happening, that the family was being told that their husband was shot down and he was either missing in action or a prisoner of war. Lemoore Naval Air Station during the Vietnam War suffered more losses than any other air station, certainly in the Navy. So it was difficult. It was something that you had to understand. It was something that you had to be very supportive of other families. It was just a part of life that everyone understood, that it could happen to you.
How did your time in Vietnam impact the rest of your career, your family, things like that? Do you, because obviously you're going to have, coming out of Vietnam, you're going to be getting new pilots, new sailors who don't have that experience, and they're not going to get that experience again for another, really 10 years.
Right.
But so how did it, impact your, your ability to be a leader, training those that hadn't been, and then also not just Vietnam, but your military as a whole is like, a father, subsequently like businessman, things like that.
I was very fortunate. I was really fortunate to be surrounded by leaders who were just superb. And as a young lieutenant or a Lieutenant JG going in, and first of all, I was starstruck by someone who's wearing a silver oak leaf, and I was absolutely dumbfounded by someone wearing 2 stars. But they were great men. They were great leaders. They were very concerned about you as an individual. They knew that your job was hard. They wanted to be so supportive of you. They knew that you were well trained. They knew that that they were assigning you missions that were going to test the upper limits of your capabilities. But they also had tremendous amount of confidence in you. And although all of that was unsaid, it was understood. And I think that really gave you a great amount of self-assurance and self-confidence that my boss and my boss's boss believes in me, and they're not afraid to give me the hard jobs. And there is an expectation that I'm going to do that job, and they are going to hold me to account. And if at any point I fail, or if at any point I don't meet that expectation, then there will be some accountability. The accountability hardly was ever in the form of discipline. The accountability was more in additional training, or in more motivation, or in more leadership from them. It was never negative. It was always positive. Because we all fail. We're all weak. But if we admit our weakness, then we grow from that. And I know that many times I failed, many times our squadron failed, but we grew from that. And with growth, comes a realization that, success is right around the corner. So that was I guess the biggest lesson that I learned as I look back on my career, and of the many just fabulous leaders that I had mentoring me and forcing me to grow, really pushing me. There were many times where I was assigned, where they would give me an assignment, and I would think to myself, I'm not sure I can do this. But I know now why they did it, because they knew full well I had that capability. They knew full well that I had the skill level to do that, and they wanted to push me because they knew I could succeed. And so they taught me that the job of a leader is to build leaders, and they did that. And I didn't know it at the time what they were doing, and but I look back on them now, and they just did a fabulous job, and many of the combat leaders in the air and leaders on the ground. I can remember coming back from combat missions late at night, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, just exhausted, and going down to the intelligence area for a debrief on the mission that we just flew. And walking down the hall is the 2-star admiral, who's the battle force commander, and looking you in the face. Here's this 2-star admiral looking at me as a Lieutenant JG, all sweaty and dirty and, scared. And he's thanking me. I mean, you talk about leadership. What is this guy doing up at 3 o'clock in the morning? He's taking care of his people. So, that goes a long way. He didn't know me. He didn't know my name. But he knew what I just came off of. And he knew it was hard. And he knew I gave it my all. He wanted to thank me. Yeah. Leaders like that, few and far between.
So after you got out of the service, I'm guessing you didn't completely retire. What was the next step?
No, I didn't retire. My mother wasn't doing well health-wise, and as I said, big family. My other brothers and sisters, they were kind of all over the universe now, doing their own thing, and my dad had passed by this time, and so I decided it was time for me to come home and take care of my mom. So I did, and I got a couple of little nickel dime jobs. I had an opportunity to fly with the airlines, but I just didn't want to, and so I decided against that. And I eventually got on board with the Federal Aviation Administration, worked with them for about 11 or 12 years or so, and then I eventually, hung it up and retired completely from getting a paycheck. But there was something that was still inside me that said, I'm not done yet, and I wanted to give back. So, and I think as I look back on why I'm currently the president of 2 nonprofits supporting veterans and veteran families, and people ask me, why are you doing this and not getting paid for it? I really think the reason is because after 26 years in the service, I had some fabulous people working for me, some young kids that were enlisted, didn't make a lot of money, had a family, and I'm not sure that I thank them. So I want to spend a lot of my time giving my all back to those kids and their families now, whatever I can do to support them, because I know that their job was hard, probably harder than mine, and so I'm not ready to give up yet. I'm not ready to say I'm done. I want to keep giving back, and I want to give back to those kids and their families. So that's what I do.
What is your, let's say, best memory from the military? Was there one just amazing thing that stands out that?
I don't know if the thing I don't know. There were so many great memories. I mean, I had so many great flying memories, but the memories to me are the friendships that I made.
Yeah.
Those guys that are now in our 70s and 80s. I haven't seen them in 10, 20, 30 years. When you get together, it's just like it was like yesterday. I don't know. There's something about the military, and there's certainly something about going to war with your buddy. I don't know what it is. But you never forget it. I don't know if there's a trust, if there's a mutual respect. I don't know what it is, but I'll never forget them. They've never forgotten me. Some of the best friendships that I'll ever make. And that's probably some of the, when I look back on my military career, I think the first thing that I look back on is the friendship.
Yeah, I understand that.
I think we're done.
Yeah, I think so.
You guys done?
Yeah, you guys are good. Do you have any harrowing, like the most harrowing story, like from a mission, or anything you want to share, or?
Certainly certainly Linebacker 2 was very harrowing. When you're getting shot at by SAM missiles, and it's nighttime, and planes are coming out of the sky because they're being shot, it's chaos. And the radio is full of chatter that you don't understand. There are missile warning signs and beeping signs that are going off in your headsets, and people are yelling that they're being shot at and going down, and you're just trying to do your job, and missiles are going off and your cockpit is lighting up, and it's chaos. So, and your knees are shaking. And you realize that you're trying to fly your airplane. It's pretty harrowing. And then you got to come back to the ship at night. So,
What do you think of movies? Any movie capture, Top Gun and those kind of things? I mean, did you feel like when you saw those movies, does it seem familiar to you, or?
I think Top Gun. I think the original Top Gun, and certainly Top Gun Maverick. They do have some great flying scenes in them. I would say that the flying scenes are really good. They're semi-accurate. There's a lot of sensationalism going on. There's a lot of spectacular things that are said and done in this movie that are unrealistic when it comes to military. But from a flying standpoint, I think the flying scenes were were fairly accurate. Yeah,
Did you, so you saw the new one then?
I did.
I haven't seen it yet.
I did,
It's on my
yeah.
to-do list.
It's one thing that the general public doesn't realize is that there are Navy guys flying that airplane. Tom Cruise didn't fly that airplane. Navy guys are flying it. So, that's. I mean, somebody's flying that airplane and they're doing a hell of a good job at it. So, do the Navy airplanes do the things that are shown in the Top Gun movie? Absolutely. They're flying low level. They're flying over mountains. They're pitching up. They're pulling G's. Yeah, all that stuff is done. But there's a lot of stuff that's going on, in the fighting scenes that are pretty unrealistic. But it's all good showmanship and, sells tickets.
Yeah. All right, well, one last question.
Okay.
So you would have been serving at the same time as General Myers. Had you guys encountered each other during service? Or?
We did not. No. Did not. I did not know General Myers at the time and did not encounter him. No.
Well, thanks, Al. We
You bet.
really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Yeah.